Thank you for coming. From the realist playbook, China may secretly want to see a surviving but seriously weakened Putin so as to further this asymmetrical relationship developing between Beijing and Moscow and delay, if not deny, the containment of China in the ongoing geopolitical struggle. However, for China, this tightrope is hard to walk and may ultimately converge on two scenarios, either China doubling down on backing Putin by arming his army, or hopefully pushing some real peace efforts by leveraging its senior status in the partnership, although it also means giving Putin some sort of an off-ramp. So my question is, if Biden's administration prefers China to choose the latter, which is peace through leverage rather than doubling down, to what extent is it a good idea to signal policy change on China or some goodwill to de-escalate the geopolitical struggle?
Want to go ahead now?
No, I don't. That's a hard, big question. First, let me talk about Xi and Putin, and then, but you asked a much larger question about U.S.-China relations. I just published a piece actually about 4 hours ago on the summit, so look it up on Substack if you want the details. I'm impressed by what Xi Jinping did not give Putin, right? You can look at it half empty, half full. He got the photo op right after he was declared, by the International Criminal Court indicted for crimes against humanity and kidnapping. He got Xi Jinping to show up, the second most powerful person in the world. And he got the photo op. By the way, it was an informal meeting, right? It wasn't a state visit, but it felt pretty formal, right? The band was playing and the soldiers were there, and there was 2 hours and 25 people on a side, because that's the image Putin wanted. But beyond that, what did he get? Did he get military assistance? If he did, it was secretly done. It wasn't announced. Did he get a big economic assistance package from Xi Jinping? No. He didn't even get, agreement about building the second pipeline. They even delayed that. And oh, by the way, his buddy, his friend, who's met for 40 times, Xi Jinping, he said, yeah, we're going to help you. We're going to buy your energy at a 30% discount from the market prices. That doesn't feel too friendly to me when you're fighting a war and you need that revenue, right? So I think Xi Jinping's trying to have his cake and eat it too, and I'm impressed by what he didn't give Putin, not what he gave him. But you asked a different question. Should we try to leverage Xi Jinping to put pressure on Putin? I don't think that's viable. I just don't. If I believed it were true, that Biden could call Xi Jinping and he could say, I'll do this for you, lift the tariffs, if you get Putin to stop his war. That would be a trade I would consider. I just don't think it's on the cards. It's not on the cards. Because I don't think Xi Jinping has that kind of leverage over Vladimir Putin right now. If I thought he did, if I thought he could call up Putin and say, hey, you know those maps you've been printing? You need to gather them all up and start printing that Ukraine is an independent country. If he had that kind of power over Putin, that might be a deal I would take. I just don't think he has that power. With respect to your bigger question, however, I think we do not need to think about every move that the Chinese make as adverse to our economic interests or our security interests. I think we've got to have a much more sophisticated, realist strategy. I'm a realist. I want to reclaim that word for the way I think about the world. Some people at this university disagree with me on that, Professor Mersheimer. But I believe that not everything they do in the world is adverse to our interests. This deal that they just brokered with between the Saudis and the Iranians, if that helps to keep peace in Yemen, I'm all for that. The peace plan that he put out, if he could get Putin to go along with point one, we should give Xi Jinping the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Focus on point one. Everybody should respect their territorial integrity. I'm not optimistic about that. I want to be clear about that. But I think just thinking that we have to stop China everywhere is what we did early in the Cold War, and I think that was a bad strategy. I think we made mistakes, and we should learn those mistakes, from those mistakes, that's the book I'm writing, and not repeat them. By the way, we should also learn the good things we did during the Cold War. We did a lot of good things during the Cold War. We're not doing those things today. Our public diplomacy right now, I think, is really antiquated. It feels like, 50 years out of date. We have got to lean in. It's great we got the 150 votes, right?
Yeah.
But those 40 neutral votes, we've got to be going after those votes. So there are lots of good things we can learn about what we did right during the Cold War. But it's both things, not just one or the other.
Well, I think Mike makes every cogent, important point here to answer your question. I would just add, we should play our own game. She does. The Chinese always have. And our game, our strategy, our way, because we have the capability. And we have the alliances and the allies. One example, from the perspective of a former Secretary of Defense, we are the most powerful nation on earth. Nobody's even close to us. We have the Russians and the Chinese with a lot of nuclear warheads, but that's a separate kind of an issue. You're not pulling a nuclear warhead out to use every other week or every month. When you look at projection of power around the world, we have that because we have alliances, we have allies that allow us bases, allow us to project power. Now, it's in their interest too, but it's certainly in our interest. And so we have big bases, submarine bases, Navy bases, air bases in the Indo-Pacific. We've got them all over the world. Nobody can compete with that. Now, that in itself is not the only calculation, but don't play China's game and don't try to stop China on some of this stuff. I think we've made some mistakes. All administrations, Republicans and Democrats, by the way, on this. You try to stop them. You're not going to stop China on growing. They steal our secrets. We know what they do, and they're dishonest. They lie about these things. Well, you're not going to stop them. Let's be smarter. Let's manage all of this using our strengths, our alliances, our allies. Use sanctions where they make sense. I'm not a big sanctions guy because I think they always blow up in your face too. And I think that's one of the mistakes the Biden administration has made. They haven't undone the Trump sanctions on some of these things. But that's for a different discussion probably. But bottom line is, let's play our game. We're the most powerful nation on earth. We have freedom on our side. We've got a lot going for us. And what Mike said, let's not play somebody else's game their way. That'd be my answer to it.
That's really smart.
Yep, this side. Yep, somebody on this side.
Hi, my question is for Mr. McFaul. You said that there's no sign Putin wants to negotiate, and you also said today that Biden doesn't want the war to drag on. But last April, Boris Johnson flew to Kiev to stop a potential peace deal, and the White House has come out against the recent Chinese peace proposal. So how can you say Putin doesn't want to negotiate when the US and the UK are the ones that are actively trying to undermine and reject the negotiations? You say you're not optimistic about the Chinese plan, but how can we know if the White House rejects it in favor of just continuing fighting to the last Ukrainian?
Well, first of all, I think the allegation that you're citing, that Boris Johnson somehow stopped a peace deal that it was all set up and then Boris flew in and stopped it, I just disagree with that history. I don't think that's accurate history. And you and I should talk about that. I'm happy to. McFaul at stanford.edu. You can email me directly. And everybody else can, I guess, now too.
Around the world.
But I just think that that's a gross overstatement. I know that story well. It leaves out the agency of President Zelensky. He's not some vassal of the British Empire. I interact with President Zelensky and his administration fairly often. every day. And if they were here right now, they would say, who are you to tell us that we had this fictitious deal that happened, and then the British Prime Minister came and gave us advice. It's quite insulting to the democratically elected president of Ukraine that some outsider should tell him what to do. And it's just not true. So that's the first thing I would say. On the peace deal, I was trying to be open about that. I think if Xi Jinping wants to play a real role in trying to mediate some settlement, we should not a priori reject that because he's Chinese, but then he's got to actually play the role of a mediator. He flew to Moscow. He didn't fly to Kiev. Did you notice that? Mediators got to play on both. They got to mediate on both sides. They can't come and say, "This is my best friend, and we're against American imperialism, and we're fighting it all together." And then the next day say, "Well, I'm an honest broker here between Kiev and Moscow." Having said that, notice Secretary Blinken. I almost promoted him. Secretary Blinken, he came out right away against the peace plan. Right? He said this is just camouflage. It's not real. President Zelensky did not. Notice that he did not do that. And that was done on purpose because he does not want to exclude the possibility that somewhere along the way, Xi Jinping might be able to play a positive role as defined by him and his own interest in his game. I just think that's a really important point you made about us. Don't forget that President Zelensky is a democratically elected leader that has agency in this. He's not just some proxy for the West, and his interests and our interests are not aligned. And he would agree with you, by the way, on fight till the last Ukrainian, right? They know that they're fighting alone, but they're going to fight alone till they decide not to fight. And if my Ukrainian colleagues were here in this room today, they would want you to know that they will make a decision about negotiating or not, and they're not going to take orders from Boris Jordan, they're not going to take orders from Xi Jinping or President Biden. And I've heard them say to me, if we have to fight for 30 years in a guerrilla warfare on the streets, that's their mindset now. And how dare us to assume that we know what's better for them than what they think is better for them.
Do you want Ivo, by the way, before we... Oh, Ivo.
Well, can we please? Yes. Ivo? Yep. President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Fascinating discussion, guys. It's really, really interesting. I want to pick up something you said, Secretary Hagel, and something you said, Mike, and see if we can sort of bring the conversation forward. You said, I think rightly, that the fight right now is about when, where, and how this war ends. And you, Mike, said that the real underlying fight for Putin is an ideological one and not a territorial one. Or at least you said that, you didn't say that not territorial, but the territory is about ideology. It's about the control of Ukraine as Slavic peoples. It seems to me that we need to start to redefine the conflict in terms of what? Which is to say the future of Ukraine, not just as a territorial entity, but as a state and what it means. And we have agency in that far more than the weapons and the immediate economic assistance we're providing, which is to offer the prospect and the promise of Western integration in a fundamental way. The EU is doing that with regard to the European Union. Whether it's doing it fast enough or not is to be decided by the Europeans. But we are not willing to have an engagement with the Ukrainians about security. Because ultimately the future of a Western integrated Ukraine is not only a democratic and a prosperous one, but a secure one, with whatever borders it may have. Those borders may be the one on 91, they may be temporarily some other border, who knows? Germany was not united until 1989. Baltic states were not independent until 1991. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the security element of the relationship, not tomorrow, but what we need to start thinking about today in order to integrate Ukraine into the West in the longer framework.
Good to see you, Mr. Ambassador. Always great comments, and I'll respond this way, and then Mike pick his piece up. I agree with what you've just said, that we need to start thinking about that. Just like, it's a different situation, obviously, but just like a couple of years before the end of World War II, Churchill and Roosevelt started talking about what's the world going to look like when this is over. And that may be going on. I mean, I don't know, because I'm not in the middle of anything anymore. I'm not privy to it all. And so that may be going on in the Biden administration, or at least some of that conversation. But it needs to be addressed for the reasons that you implied in your question, as to where does this go after the when and how this gets resolved, because what then is the role of Ukraine in the West? They want to join NATO. They want to join the EU. Well, as you know, you were ambassador to NATO. There are certain requirements that a country has to undergo and commit to before they can be eligible to join NATO. It's not just good enough, we'd like to join. So all those kinds of questions are big questions, and they need to be thought through. I don't think that they're the forefront questions now, because you've still got a war going on, and how long that goes, nobody knows. But I think your point is that we need to start thinking about this and talking to our European friends about it, and maybe it has started. So, I mean, I don't have much to add other than I agree with you, and it's the right approach.
I'd be interested in Ambassador Dalder's answer to his own question, by the way. Maybe we can do that later.
Dinner.
I do think you're exactly right. I mean, and the Ukrainians have their own ideas. Rasmussen and Andriy Yermak actually published an idea for security. And that's the other thing I meant to say about agency. You all know President Zelensky has also published his own peace plan. And he's very frustrated that we don't give it enough attention. And I just did exactly what he gets frustrated about. We talked about Xi Jinping's plan. Why is his 10-point, 12-point as well? As a starting place, at least he's published one. We should, Putin should publish his, and that should help the negotiation. And they feel the same way on your question, Eva, which is on the EU integration. They want to go faster than the EU does, but there's a plan on reconstruction. They want that to be not just an EU project. They want that to be an American project, a small d, small l project that involves the Koreans and the Japanese and everybody, right? Because they don't think just EU accession is going to be enough for them. They also want the private sector to be very involved in that, and I think they're exactly right about that. And part of that has to be consolidating and deepening democracy as they do that, right? You cannot sequence those things. And that's a bit of a tension point, I would say, between some in Ukraine versus some on the outside. But that's got to be a big bang project at the end of the war, and partly because they have to attract back all the Ukrainians that have left, right? And you're not going to attract them back if they just go back to the ways that you were describing 10 or 20 years ago. And I'm cautiously optimistic about that. There's a thriving civil society, even during the war. There's a private sector there. There's entrepreneurs there. They think they can play a big role in military production, by the way. Oh, and by the way, they think they have a really effective army that could provide security for Europeans that don't have as effective security, right? So they think there's even financial benefit from being more integrated on the security side. But nobody, including me, right now, is answering their fundamental question. We will not have all that investment come in if we don't have security. I'm not optimistic that there would be a push for NATO membership after the war. And so I think the more creative idea of bilateral military commitments, first and foremost with us, that are deep, long-term, and we go all in right when the peace happens, right? So all the weapon systems that we can't do because we're worried about escalation of the war, when I disagree with my colleagues in the Biden administration about that, but if we're at the end of the war, then ATACMS are not escalating the war, it's deterrence. And I think thinking harder about that, where the borders would be and what kind of weapon systems would provide that, where you just go all in and allow the Ukrainians to have the capabilities to deter a future war, that's where the attention should be.